ABA Day Digital 2020. We're so glad you could join us today from wherever you are around the country as we try to reach out to our members of Congress on behalf of the issues that are currently moving but need our support to get across the finish line. My name is Eric Story, and I'm the Director of Grassroots and Digital Advocacy here at the American Bar Association. And over the next 2 days, Allison Rosenstock and I are going to take you through a few of these issues and let you know how you can use your voice to make the most impact. We're going to get things started today by talking about the importance of the Legal Services Corporation. So with no further ado, I'm going to kick it over to the ABA's Director of Legal Services, Jason Vale. Jason, take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here during ABA Day 2020, and it's a special pleasure to be moderating this panel, discussing the importance of the Legal Services Corporation and the work that LSC does. I'm joined today by 4 panelists who are all very prestigious, and we're very lucky to have them. First up, we have Laura Farber with Hahn & Hahn LLP, who's a member of the Litigation and Employment Practice Groups and has been involved at all kinds of levels of the ABA leadership over the years. We have Ted Howard, who is the pro bono partner at Wiley Ryan LLP, and who is also the chair of the Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defendants at the ABA. We also have Radhika Singh, who is the chief of the Civil Legal Services Division at the National Legal Aid and Defender Association. And finally, we're joined by Andrew Van Single, who is the chair of the ABA Standing Committee on Disaster Response and Preparedness, and is a special advisor to the ABA-YLD Disaster Legal Services Program. So welcome to you all. I have a number of questions to run through during our time today, talking about LSC, and in particular the role of LSC during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis that we're faced with right now. I'll be calling on the various panelists to answer questions, but any of you can feel free to jump in and share your thoughts or give input on any of these questions. So please don't hold back as we go through. But where I really like to do is, what I like to do is just start where at a kind of a fundamental place and talk about the importance of LSC itself and what LSC does and why it's so important. And for that, Radhika, maybe you can lead this off and talk a little bit about the common types of legal services that LSC funds through its grantee programs. What kinds of services does it provide? Who does it serve? And what does LSC and its funding really accomplish?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jason, and thank you all. I'm excited to be part of this panel and part of ABA Day. What the ABA does to support LSC every year is really probably one of the most important things that can be done in support of legal services across the country. So just to say briefly, LSC, the Legal Services Corporation, is the single largest national funder of legal aid, legal services to low-income people across the country. It operates as an independent nonprofit and distributes its grants on a competitive basis, but it serves and its grantees are 132 legal services programs across the country, and in the territories they serve people, individuals, and communities in every congressional district and every county in the country. So really what LSC does provide, and through its grantees, are legal services that are the backbone of services to low-income communities across the country. It is the national infrastructure for legal services. You'd imagine that without a federal program like the Legal Services Corporation, that you would have disparate, even more disparate services provided across the country in terms of providing services to rural areas, to special populations, populations with special needs, older Americans, veterans. These are the people who are served by the Legal Services Corporation and its grantees. And really what we're talking about are services that really provide long-term impact in terms of what people need every day in terms of being able to have stable lives, to have safe lives. So services that provide housing and make sure people do not get unfairly and illegally evicted from their housing, that make sure people have access to employment and healthcare, that people who are experiencing domestic and intimate partner violence are safe and can access the income supports that they need and the shelter that they need. Those are the services that these programs provide every day. So it's really everyday needs to the most vulnerable among us all across the country.
And so among those services, though, there are some things that LSC programs can't do. Isn't that right? Aren't there certain limitations on what they can and can't do?
There are limitations on what LSC grantees can provide in terms of services. And this is, these are kind of, I think, some myths that are still perpetuated, but LSC grantees, again, like I mentioned earlier, serve individuals and communities. They do not bring class action lawsuits. They're really focused on the needs that the communities are bringing to their doors every day. And they're serving, they're not serving undocumented people except in terms of accessing safety. So we're talking really about, again, what this country needs to survive in terms of the backbone of keeping communities stable and safe. Those are the services that are provided.
And in the context of ABA Day, and anyone else could jump in on this too, in thinking about the limitations on some of the services, just in your opinion, how do you see those restrictions that have been put into place now, more than 20 years ago? How is that sort of facilitated bipartisan support for funding for LSC? Radhika?
I don't know if you're waiting for me to chime in or if Ted was going to chime in, but I mean, I can say as one of the organizations, along with the ABA, who really is quite active in advocating for support in Congress, the fact, again, that the federal funding that is going to the Legal Services Corporation and its grantees are there to provide for everyday needs of Americans really has grown bipartisan support and allowed for Congress to provide in recent years increases in funding and really allowed us to emphasize and show how important legal services are to provide to low-income communities.
Great. Well, one question that I think a lot of folks have, and maybe Ted, I'll turn this to you as the pro bono partner at Wiley Ryan. Obviously, pro bono is your area of expertise, and why is it that we need federal funding for LSC? Why can't pro bono just take care of the legal issues for those who can't otherwise afford it? Why is that? Why do we need LSC?
Thanks, Jason, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this important discussion. I think that as a lawyer who spends his time both working on pro bono matters myself, but also, attempting to cajole, persuade, sometimes threaten my colleagues to try to do more. I think it's a huge misapprehension on the part of folks who think that pro bono lawyers can fill the void. If every single lawyer in a private firm of 50 lawyers or more in the country did 100 hours of pro bono a year, it wouldn't come anywhere near filling the needs that exist. And that's why there clearly needs to be the level of pro bono activity that there is, and there needs to be much more, frankly, from not only a personal standpoint, but also from a professional responsibility standpoint. But pro bono lawyers cannot possibly fill the void that would exist if the Legal Services Corporation wasn't funded as robustly as it is, and frankly, the Legal Services Corporation needs far more than it actually is funded at this point in time.
Well, thanks, Ted. This is a different kind of ABA Day, obviously, since we're all here on Zoom and not in DC in person. And of course, the thing that's foremost in everyone's mind is the pandemic and how, in particular, it's going to impact those who are the most vulnerable, those who are served by LSC grantees. And I'd really like to focus on that right now. Starting with you, Andrew, especially given your role as chair of disaster response and preparedness, what are your thoughts about what impact this pandemic is going to have on the need for the kind of legal services that LSC provides? I mean, they're already serving 1.8 million people a year, and now we can anticipate there will be a lot more in the way of legal problems faced by those who have lost their jobs or low income, all of that. How do you see the current situation affecting the need for
Thanks,
solutions?
Jason. COVID-19 is really unique because when we think in the sense of a traditional natural disaster like a Hurricane Katrina or Harvey or Irma type event, it's relatively isolated. And so the challenge with COVID-19 is that that's bringing the scale of that devastation to a national level. And it's also cutting across different areas of the population that might not otherwise be affected. So for example, in a hurricane, you could have people who have adequate insurance and their losses are going to be somewhat insulated through that insurance, but there's a lot of really complicated issues that happen because of COVID-19, and it's impacting a single parent, victims of domestic violence. We're seeing significant increases in those cases. We're seeing, with the stay-at-home order, how that's causing issues just with potentially civil unrest, and whether it's the governor's authority to make some of those requests. And so we're really seeing just a significant scale up of the legal needs, but the supply of the people to do that work, which is largely done through grantees of LSC, that's relatively constant. And while you were speaking earlier and Ted was kind of explaining more about the pro bono aspect, I was at a task force hearing in Ann Arbor a couple months ago, and they said something that really stuck with me. Now, I'm a Michigan State Spartan fan, so I'll still allow the U of M reference, but they said if you filled up U of M Wolverine Stadium, which is about 110,000 people, they said there'd be about, and if you filled that up with people eligible for legal aid, there'd be about 10 or 11 people, attorneys in that stadium that could essentially help with that need. And so that really gives some context as what we're really up against. So with all of the funding that we get, it's much needed, but the need is very, very significant without a disaster. And so this COVID-19, this is going to have long and deep and far-reaching impacts on society from years to come. We see that with natural disasters 5-10 years after the event. There's some lingering trauma that sticks with those communities. And so it will be interesting to see what will happen with this. And I think that's, whether we're successful is really contingent on if we have enough resources for LSC and also a significant investment from the pro bono community.
Well, and that does lead to another question, which is about funding. The ABA, along with NLADA and other groups, asked Congress to provide an extra $100 million in emergency funding over and above what LSC requested for the upcoming fiscal year, just to address the issues of the pandemic. There was appropriation of $50 million in emergency funding in the CARES Act, but we again, and along with NLADA and others, have gone back to Congress and asked for another $50 million. Maybe talk a little bit more about why that's so important, and whether Radhika or Laura or any of you really just can talk about what does LSC do during, obviously we don't have pandemics as an example, this is pretty new, but certainly natural disasters and some other situations that have happened in the past where they have addressed these kinds of issues. Why is it so important, and what can LSC do, and what does LSC do to address those sorts of disasters.
Well, some of the cases that they would typically, that funding is directly correlated to how many attorneys that can essentially be staffed to meet the increasing demands from a disaster or a global pandemic such as COVID-19. And so, like I said before, you're seeing an increase of domestic violence issues. So attorneys are needed to help secure orders of protection. There's nationwide and local moratoriums on evictions and foreclosures, but we're also seeing landlords taking self-help, doing lockouts, getting pretty creative. There was just a story in the Washington Post a couple days ago about landlords going on to the IRS stimulus locator, and they had some of the tenant's personal information, and they were accessing that, essentially demanding payment, saying, we know you got this stimulus payment, and threatening to take self-help measures, which the self-help measures in itself are unlawful, but so is accessing that information, and may have opened up to some criminal liability there as well. But that's just kind of a flavor of the issues that we're seeing. We're seeing people who are elderly and who want to have their will, power of attorney updated because they may be at risk. And there's issues as to access to the courts, or just having attorneys being able to go to these people to get signatures. So there's issues with witnesses and changing some of the rules of how to execute a valid power of attorney. So there's all these different types of legal issues, and without funding, there's no legal aid attorneys to do it. And so that's why continued funding and consistent funding is really critical at this point. And I know that Congress is looking at making additional appropriations. I heard earlier today that they were talking about part 4 of their kind of their stimulus package, which is to help replenish the PPP program and some other provisions to get testing. And so that needs to be part of that conversation, is that when you see a disaster, you think of ambulances, fire trucks, but after those fire trucks, the news crews, and everybody leaves, there's longstanding legal issues that are going to be there for weeks, months, and even years.
I was going to also add that part of this is leveraging. I mean, if you think about it, we need to have a full complement of lawyers working that provide these kind of services, but we also need the pro bono and the lawyers and firms and small practices, solo practices, to work with them to leverage. And so if we don't have enough people for the initial access and the initial services to be rendered, screened, whatever you want to call it, then the rest of the bar is also at a disadvantage in terms of being able to help, because we all want to do that. We want to get involved. We want to find ways of being of assistance. But when you don't have the foundation that LSC provides, you can't contribute and help, the needs, which are exponential during something like this pandemic. And, just access to the court system in and of itself for someone who is practicing law, I can speak to California right now, is a whole adventure, because we get on webinars with our presiding judge who tells us, well, only these certain circumstances will give you access. Otherwise, don't expect to get into court anytime soon. Don't expect to have any jury trials. Don't expect this and that. And that's for us. Imagine what it's like for individuals and others who don't even know how to navigate, let alone have an attorney that can help them, or legal services staff that can help them get to other resources, other places that can assist. And so this becomes an exponential, crucial crisis that without this funding will basically have everything falling apart, which we cannot afford to have for these people in deep need. And the thing is, it's hitting everyone across the board. When we do our typical lobbying on ABA Day, we like to point out that, this is hitting every district, and we have statistics that show, homeless veterans, victims of domestic abuse and violence, and, tenants who can't afford, based on the moratoriums, don't know how to navigate the various rules that may differ from city to city, at least in my area. You've got different cities with municipal ordinances that impact all of that. And just navigating the basics are so complicated now because of what measures have been taken in the system. We need to realize the importance of being able to communicate, share the information, have access in whatever method, whether that's with technology that a lot of courts are now using. We need to make sure that all of those places have the ability to function at a bare minimum. And now the needs are so great. That's the reason that the demand for, or the request for the higher funding is imperative right now.
I'll just add to that a little bit, because I want to build on this point about technology. I mean, when you think about the role that LSC can play, of course, its grantees are playing the role of providing these services to people who need them. And when you think about 20 million people filing for unemployment over the last 4 weeks, and that's going to get worse, and at some point, that the unemployment they receive is going to decrease, right? That extra $600 is not going to come in. And those people are going to be in a longer term state of being part of this group of people who are low income, people who qualify and are eligible for services. So in the very sense of just having more people who need help. And then you have the exacerbation of issues that Andrew spoke about. But then you also think about how these programs have had to shift so much, right? Laura talked about the courts changing the way they're operating, and even being able to access those courts requires some level of technology that was not there before. Being able to deliver services remotely requires some level of technology that was not there before. These programs, what we're asking these programs to do is shift the way they're operating, shift the way they're delivering services, and make sure that they can continue to deliver those services, make sure that they can conduct outreach to these communities who may not be able to walk through their doors, right, anymore. And that's a lot to ask of people. I was on a call earlier, and maybe some of you were on that call as well, where we had the executive director in New Orleans talk about the illegal evictions and people having to go out in person with hand sanitizer on their hips, and gloves available, but they still have to go to the court, and they have to figure out how to file that temporary restraining order to make sure that person is not being illegally evicted, and to stop those actions. And that's something that LSC can do, right? We're talking about these legal services providers being the backbone and the core infrastructure to allow for everybody else to participate and serve people. LSC itself is the backbone for those legal services providers. They have, with the as part of the $50 million that was just received through the CARES Act, been able to provide funding to enable those programs to buy the laptops that they need. When you think about remote service delivery and how it occurred before, people in rural communities were able to go to their churches, and they were able to go to their libraries, and they were able to sit at kiosks and have some guidance and assistance to access the technology they need. We've got to think about that in a whole different way now. How are we going to provide that and make sure that's possible? And LSC can really pull together the best of the best across the country and best practices, and make sure all of its grantees are learning from each other, and figuring out in this new space how to do things most effectively and efficiently. And I don't want that piece of LSC to be lost either, because the need is great, and this need is going to continue for years. I mean, we're talking about other streams of funding too. So when you think about LSC, for some programs, it's 80% of funding for programs in rural areas and rural states. And I think the legal services community across the country has done a lot to try to diversify its funding, but we're in an unprecedented situation now where all of those funding streams are being hit very hard. And so when we're thinking longer term, how is this going to play out? How are we going to be able to meet the needs over years and years? The funding we can secure now is so critical to make sure there's a consistency in the services delivered, that we're not going to drop off 6 months from now and say, I was using 80% of my budget to pay for my staff. I know I need more staff now, but I actually need to lay them off because I don't have the funding. It's such a critical point in time for Congress to recognize that what it does now and how it acts now, both with regard to stimulus funding and with regard to appropriations, they've got to be thinking long-term. How do we make sure, these, we can call them collateral consequences, but the legal services providers are the first responders to those consequences, right? And we've got to make sure they're taken care of as well, and that we can make sure those services are provided if we're ever going to be able to pull our communities out of this.
Well, I think you've all done a great job of illustrating why the funding is so critical, especially during this time. And I'd like to just maybe turn it back to you, Laura, with another question, which is this LSC funding has been a priority for ABA Day for a while. How do you see the support being provided by the ABA, especially during ABA Day, as being effective in increasing funding for LSC?
Oh, I think it's crucial. There's no question in my mind. I've actually seen it in action where we've gone and in person, and now we're not doing it in person, which will be interesting, but I think it'll be wonderful. And I think it'll be welcomed. But we've gone and we've provided the information which is accessible to us as lawyers, as volunteers, as ABA members, to our representatives, to our senators, and said, look, here's what's going on, and here's how this will help and make a difference. And not only have we, and I'm proud to say this, I mean, we actually, I won't say who, but we flipped someone, meaning they were not big supporters. And after meeting with us, I still tell the story because I get very excited about things like that. They're victories of all kinds. But the reason I say that is because it really does take a variety of people, a lot of influence, but also because there's so much bipartisan support at this point. You know, we shouldn't take that for granted, though. We need to continue to educate. We need to continue to show why the needs are there, and especially now, why they're grown. And what are we doing with the funding that is being provided, and how can we impact the communities where these folks are and their own districts? When you bring it home, when you show the impact that you can create, you the representative, you the senator, by us providing you with that information, it's huge. And I truly believe that, especially constituents, obviously, we always say when we're lobbying, get as many constituents. And for California, I'm the co-captain for California, we're always struggling to have, you know, people in all of our districts because we're such a big state. But we're definitely more effective when we have constituents. And we have so many ABA members that, especially during this time right now, can get involved, because the way to get involved doesn't require you to get on a plane and travel and stay in a hotel and do the typical things that we do. You can do this by getting on your technology and setting up a Zoom meeting, a phone call, whatever it is. There's never been a time where being involved and getting involved and doing this advocacy has been easier in terms of time, in terms of expense, in terms of management, but also crucial. And so I will implore all of my ABA co-fellow volunteers to get involved, get active with your representative or any representatives within your delegation, and get our message out, because this is the time, this is the way to do it. It has never been easier and more important than now.
That's great, and we're running out of time. I just want to on that point maybe ask one more question, I think, which will help facilitate that effort to get out the word, and that is on the kind of the details of what the funding ask is. And Ted, maybe I'll turn this to you because, as you know, SCLAID does a lot of work within the ABA to advocate for funding for LSC year after year. So as folks are going out and talking to their representatives and senators about LSC, what is the ask this year that LSC is making? And how do they really make the argument that that amount is justified, given, again, the great need that we have at this time?
Right. Well, the current ask for FY 2021 is $652 million, up from the current level, putting aside emergency appropriations, of $440 million. It seems like a large number, and it seems like a big jump. It's entirely justified by the fact that even at $652 million, it's something of a drop in the bucket in terms of the actual overall need as reflected by things like the 2017 LSC study that was done with regard to needs analysis. You know, it's a number that is not the ideal, but it's a number that reflects careful and you know, conscientious evaluation with regard to what can be done on the basis of that number if fully funded. You know, particularly given that whatever additional emergency appropriations that may come out of this current legislative effort specific to COVID-19 and trying to stimulate or maintain the economy, you know, for reasons that all of my colleagues have touched on, this the ultimate impact of this pandemic is going to be felt for years. And so while the $50 million that was already appropriated in the CARES Act and the $50 million that may be included in the fourth round of stimulus will certainly be important for the reasons they touched on. The $652 million was based on an assessment of needs that didn't even take into account, you know, the pandemic. That number preceded the pandemic by months. And so it's really critical for our legislators at the federal level to understand and appreciate what is done by LSC, what the return on investment in LSC is. There are numerous studies that reflect how much money local and state governments actually save over time as a result of the work that LSC does. And so, you know, I think that it's absolutely critical, and I think that those who are going to participate in this effort can absolutely feel very, very comfortable in the approach that they're making to their legislators about the need for this funding.
Thanks, Ted. So I think that's really helpful. So 652.6 million is the ask, as you say, that was made before the pandemic. And then, of course, we are also advocating for the additional 50 million that wasn't initially received in the CARES Act. So I believe that's all we have time for today. So thanks to everyone who's getting out and participating in ABA Day, virtually or otherwise, and
or staying in, as the case may be.
We're staying in, right? All right. Well, thank you again, and we appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Jason.
So much.
Thank you all.
Take care. Stay safe, everyone.